In the quiet, idyllic streets of Arlington, the tranquility that had always defined this affluent town was suddenly shattered. The murder of Ronan Valmont, a man well known and respected for his work as an architect, sent shockwaves through the tightly knit community. Arlington had always prided itself on its picturesque homes, perfect lawns, and friendly neighbors, but beneath the veneer of suburban perfection lurked a darkness that no one had expected. On the surface, the Valmonts seemed like the quintessential couple, successful, charismatic, and well-liked. But in August 2019, their carefully curated image would crumble, revealing a web of secrets that had festered for far too long. At the center of this tragedy was Ronan Valmont, a 54-year-old architect responsible for designing many of the luxurious homes that made Arlington the epitome of suburban elegance. His wife, Serena Valmont, 46, ran a high-end boutique in town, known for her impeccable fashion sense and her involvement in local charity events. Together, they represented the perfect image of success and stability. Their large, beautifully designed home was the envy of the neighborhood, and they often hosted lavish gatherings for their friends and neighbors. To everyone who knew them, the Valmonts were the perfect couple, a model of what every marriage and every life in Arlington should aspire to be. But beneath this picture-perfect life, there were cracks. Cracks that only a few people in Arlington might have noticed but would have dismissed as ordinary wear and tear on a long-standing marriage. Ronan was a man driven by his work, spending long hours away from home, consumed by his projects and his clients. His career, while prestigious and lucrative, left little time for his personal life. Serena, left alone for long stretches of time, began to feel neglected. As the years passed, her loneliness grew, but outwardly, she kept up appearances, attending charity functions, running her boutique, and maintaining the illusion that everything was perfect in the Valmont household. It was during these moments of isolation that Kellen Graves, a 21-year-old college student and the son of their neighbors, entered Serena's life. Kellen had moved to Arlington with his parents, Vernon and Edith Graves, just over a year ago, seeking the quiet suburban lifestyle that Arlington offered. Kellen, studying environmental science at the local university, was intelligent and soft-spoken, often seen helping out around the neighborhood with odd jobs or assisting his parents with their expansive garden. Kellen's presence in Serena's life began innocuously enough. He would stop by to help her with her garden, or assist with small tasks around the house. His youthful energy and genuine kindness filled a void that Serena had long felt in her marriage. As the summer months progressed, their interactions became more frequent, and before long, an emotional bond had formed. Serena found herself drawn to Kellen's attentiveness in ways she hadn't felt toward Ronan in years. Kellen, for his part, was flattered by the attention from a woman as sophisticated and admired as Serena. What began as a harmless connection soon spiraled into something far more dangerous, a secret affair that would ultimately lead to Ronan's violent death. In August 2019, the secret that Serena and Kellen had carefully kept hidden came to a head. Ronan, after returning from a business meeting earlier than expected, walked into his own home, only to discover the two of them together. What happened next would forever change the lives of those involved and leave a permanent stain on the once pristine reputation of Arlington. Ronan, caught off guard by the betrayal, reacted with uncontrollable rage. Years of frustration, work stress, and personal neglect boiled over in that moment. The confrontation between Ronan and Kellen quickly escalated into violence. And in a panicked struggle, Kellen grabbed a marble candlestick from the mantel and struck Ronan, killing him instantly. For a brief moment, there was silence. The house, once a symbol of the Valmont family's success, now held the lifeless body of the man who had built his life around it. Serena and Kellen, shocked and terrified by what had just happened, stood frozen, unable to comprehend the reality of the situation. In their minds, this wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be a summer fling, a distraction from Serena's loneliness. But now it had turned into something far more sinister. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Serena quickly took charge. They couldn't let anyone find out what had happened. The stakes were too high for both of them. Kellen, panicked and overwhelmed with guilt, agreed to help Serena cover up the crime. They wrapped Ronan's body in a sheet, struggling under the weight as they carried it down the stairs and loaded it into the back of Kellen's truck. Together, they drove to a remote construction site on the outskirts of town, where they dumped Ronan's body in a shallow ravine. They hoped the secluded location would buy them enough time to figure out their next move. When they returned home, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. Bloodstains, broken furniture, and the remnants of their violent confrontation remained. Serena, her hands shaking, set to work cleaning up the evidence, scrubbing the bloodstains from the floor, and disposing of anything that could link them to the crime. Hours passed in tense silence as they tried to erase every trace of what had happened, but no amount of cleaning could erase the guilt that now weighed heavily on both of them. The once serene home in Arlingstone had now become a crime scene, and the clock was ticking. As the sun set on that fateful day, Serena and Kellen could only hope that their desperate actions would be enough to keep the truth hidden. Little did they know this was just the beginning of their unraveling. The sun rose slowly over Arlingstone the morning after the murder, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. But for Serena Valmont, the light brought no comfort. Inside her, a darkness had settled, a gnawing fear that clung to her, refusing to let go. The night had passed in an agonizing haze of panic and guilt. The image of Ronan's lifeless body, wrapped in a sheet and discarded like an unwanted object at the construction site, played repeatedly in her mind. She had scrubbed every inch of the house, erasing the physical evidence of the violent confrontation. The bloodstains had been cleaned, the broken furniture discarded, and the marble candlestick, the murder weapon, was now buried alongside her husband's body in the ravine. Yet no amount of cleaning could wash away the weight of what she and Kellen had done. Every breath she took seemed heavier than the last, her chest tight with the knowledge that their secret could unravel at any moment. Serena forced herself to go through the motions of her day. She knew she had to act as though nothing had happened. The boutique awaited her, and the people of Arlingstone were none the wiser. Her neighbors hadn't seen anything unusual. She had to believe that. But despite her best efforts to maintain composure, the guilt was suffocating. Every sound felt amplified. Every glance from passers-by felt like an accusation. She could already hear the whisper that would start if anyone began to suspect the truth. By the time she reached the boutique, her phone buzzed with a new voicemail. Ingrid, Ronan's assistant, had called. She played the message, and her heart dropped. As expected, Ingrid was worried. Ronan hadn't shown up for work, and he hadn't called to explain his absence. It hadn't even been 24 hours. And already, the cracks in their story were starting to show. Serena gripped the phone tightly as she tried to think of how to respond. She had to act quickly. She called back, feigning calm, as she explained that Ronan had left for a sudden business trip. The lie came easily, but it felt like swallowing poison. She hoped that this excuse would buy her time, just a few more days to think, to plan, to figure out how to keep this from spiraling out of control. But deep down, she knew that it was only a temporary solution. Sooner or later, people would start asking more questions. As she moved through the day, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The boutique felt like a cage, trapping her with her own thoughts. Every time the door opened, she braced herself, half expecting the police to walk in. The memory of the marble candlestick striking Ronan replayed over and over in her mind, each time more vivid, each time more horrifying. The weight of that moment hung over her like a cloud, dark and suffocating. Meanwhile, across town, the first formal steps in the investigation had begun. At Ronan's office, his absence had caused more concern than Serena anticipated. His reputation for professionalism meant that a missed meeting was highly unusual. His colleagues, already suspicious after a full day of silence, began contacting his family and friends. Ingrid, increasingly worried after speaking to Serena, relayed her concerns to Ronan's business partner. Within hours, the police were notified of his unexplained disappearance. Detective Harper Bishop received the missing persons report the following morning. Arlingstone wasn't the kind of place where people vanished without a trace, and Bishop knew that Ronan Valmont's absence was more than a simple oversight. Her instincts told her that something was wrong. There were no records of Ronan traveling, and no one seemed to know where he had gone. When Bishop made her first phone call to Serena, she repeated the story about the business trip, but something in her voice didn't sit right. It was too rehearsed, too calm. Bishop wasted no time in digging deeper. Her first step was to question the neighbors. In a town like Arlingstone, people were always watching, even when they weren't aware of it. Someone had to have seen something. She began knocking on doors, talking to the residents who lived near the Valmont house. At first, the responses were routine. No one had seen Ronan leave, but many of them mentioned seeing Kellen Graves' truck parked at the Valmont's home recently. More often than usual, Bishop made a note of it. Kellen's name was one that had come up more than once. He lived just next door, a college student home for the summer. Nothing about his presence seemed suspicious on its own, but Bishop's experience told her that small details often led to larger discoveries. She made a mental note to follow up with the Graves family. Back at the Valmont house, the forensic team was called in. Serena had done her best to clean up the scene, but she wasn't an expert. Small traces of blood remained, barely detectable to the naked eye. but visible under the right conditions. The investigators meticulously combed through the house, searching for any signs that would indicate foul play. The broken fragments of furniture were a clear indication that something violent had occurred. Serena felt the net closing in around her. Each day, the investigation grew more intense. The police were methodical, and though she hadn't been directly accused of anything yet, she knew it was only a matter of time. Her lies were starting to unravel, and Kellen's silence only made things worse. She hadn't heard from him since they parted ways after dumping Ronan's body, and that silence unnerved her. She needed to know that he wouldn't crack under pressure. The weight of what they had done was slowly crushing them both. Kellen had been erratic from the start, shaken by the reality of the murder, and Serena knew he was struggling to hold it together. If he broke, if he confessed to anyone, it would be the end of everything. The guilt was eating away at her, but there was no turning back now. The body was hidden, the murder weapon buried, but the truth was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. As the days passed, Serena tried to maintain her composure, but it became harder with each passing hour. The questions from Ronan's colleagues, the probing eyes of the police, and the whispers from the neighbors all felt like daggers, inching closer and closer to the truth. She could see it in the way people looked at her. There was suspicion there, even if no one had said it out loud yet. Detective Bishop wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but she knew something wasn't right. The bloodstains, the broken furniture, the inconsistencies in Serena's story, it all pointed to a darker truth. She could feel it in her gut. The investigation had only just begun, but already the threads were beginning to unravel, and when they did, there would be no hiding from what had happened in the Velmont household. As the sun set over Arlingstone that evening, Serena sat alone in the darkened house. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the ticking of the clock. She had tried to control everything, but now it was slipping away. The veil of normalcy she had tried so desperately to maintain was beginning to tear, and soon the truth would come spilling out. The following week was one of constant tension for Serena Velmont. Every hour that passed felt like a ticking clock, counting down to her inevitable discovery. Despite her best efforts to maintain the facade of normalcy, the pressure of keeping the truth hidden weighed on her every moment. She spent her days in the boutique, smiling at customers and attending to business. But her mind was always elsewhere, focused on the web of lies she had spun and how quickly it might unravel. The police investigation into Ronan's disappearance was now in full swing, led by the persistent and meticulous Detective Harper Bishop. While Serena had successfully deflected the initial questions with her story about the business trip, she knew it wouldn't hold forever. Bishop was not the type to be easily misled, and already there were small cracks forming in the carefully constructed narrative Serena had built. Ronan's absence had become the talk of the town. Arlingstone was a place where people noticed the smallest changes, and the disappearance of someone as prominent as Ronan Velmont was impossible to ignore. Rumors swirled, and Serena could feel the weight of the community's suspicion beginning to press down on her. It wasn't just the police she had to worry about, it was the eyes of her neighbors, the questions they might start asking, and the stories they might piece together. At the same time, Serena knew that she had to stay ahead of the investigation. She couldn't afford any mistakes. That morning, as she sat in her boutique, she went over the details in her head. Every lie she had told had to be perfect, airtight. She had considered every angle, every potential question, but no matter how much she prepared, there was always the fear that one small oversight could bring everything crashing down. What Serena hadn't anticipated was the determination of Detective Bishop. Although Bishop hadn't confronted her directly with any evidence yet, Serena could sense the detective's quiet persistence. Bishop had been making regular visits to the neighborhood, asking questions, gathering information, and slowly piecing together a timeline. Serena knew that the detective's suspicions were growing, even if there was no proof. Yet, what made the situation even more dangerous was Kellen. Serena hadn't spoken to him in days, and his silence was unnerving. She didn't know if he was keeping his distance out of fear, guilt, or something else. But the lack of communication only added to her anxiety. If Kellen made a mistake, if he broke under pressure, everything they had done would be exposed. He had seemed so composed during the act of covering up the crime. But now, Serena worried that the guilt would overwhelm him. As the days passed, Bishop grew more focused on the Velmont household. The subtle inconsistencies in Serena's story hadn't gone unnoticed. The neighbors had been helpful, but their accounts were fragmented, and none of them had seen Ronan leave for his supposed trip. Bishop's instincts told her that something was wrong. Serena was hiding something, and Bishop intended to find out what it was. However, Serena had been careful. The house had been thoroughly cleaned. The furniture that had been broken during the struggle was discreetly replaced, and the murder weapon, the marble candlestick, had been buried along with Ronan's body at the construction site. But no matter how smart Serena thought she had been, she couldn't control everything. She couldn't account for every angle Bishop might take. One such angle was the security cameras that dotted the roads leading out of Arlingstone. While the town itself was too small to have extensive surveillance, there were cameras along the major highways that connected to the larger cities. Bishop had requested access to the footage, hoping to find any sign of Ronan's vehicle. If Ronan had truly left on a business trip, he would have had to pass one of these cameras. But after hours of reviewing footage, there was no sign of his car. This detail, while small, was significant. It meant that Ronan had never left Arlingstone, or at least not in his own vehicle. Bishop began to shift her focus. If Ronan hadn't left town, where was he? And more importantly, why was Serena lying about it? The detective's instincts told her that Serena knew more than she was letting on, but there was still no direct evidence to link her to any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Serena's paranoia grew. She had anticipated that the police would search for Ronan's car, and she had taken steps to hide it, parking it in a nondescript garage several miles away. But no matter how much she planned, she couldn't shake the feeling that Bishop was closing in. Every time she saw the detective in the neighborhood, every time a neighbor mentioned the investigation, it felt like a noose tightening around her. To complicate matters further, a small but important piece of evidence had slipped through Serena's meticulous cover-up. One of the Valmont's neighbors, an elderly woman named Althea Granger, had seen Kellen's truck parked outside the Valmont home on the night of Ronan's disappearance. While Althea hadn't thought much of it at the time, the ongoing investigation had prompted her to remember the detail. She mentioned it casually to one of the detectives, not realizing its significance. But for Bishop, this was another piece of the puzzle, a puzzle that was slowly beginning to take shape. Serena, unaware of this new information, continued her attempts to outsmart the investigation. She spent hours crafting a plausible narrative for Ronan's extended absence, carefully planting the idea that he might have left town for personal reasons, perhaps a retreat to clear his head from the stress of work. But this story, like all her others, was starting to wear thin. The people around her were beginning to grow suspicious, and Bishop was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Still, Bishop didn't yet have enough to bring Serena in for formal questioning. The detective was cautious, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the meantime, she continued to gather evidence, watching Serena closely and waiting for the moment when the cracks in her story became too large to ignore. One evening, as Serena sat alone in her house, the weight of her lies pressing down on her, she received a phone call. It was from Kellen. His voice was shaky, filled with guilt and fear. He told her that he couldn't keep doing this, that the guilt was too much to bear. Serena's heart raced as she listened, her mind scrambling to come up with a solution. She knew that if Kellen broke, everything they had done would come to light. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. As she hung up the phone, Serena realized that her careful web of lies was beginning to unravel, and there was only so much time left before everything came crashing down. She needed to act quickly, but what could she do? The walls were closing in, and the investigation was drawing closer by the day. The next morning, Detective Bishop arrived at the Valmont house with a search warrant. The search of the Valmont house was the turning point in the investigation. Detective Bishop had finally obtained enough circumstantial evidence to justify a deeper dive into Serena's life. The warrant allowed the police to search for any physical evidence that could explain Ronan's disappearance, and Bishop was determined to find something that would link Serena directly to the crime. Serena had been meticulous in cleaning up the house after the murder, but no one could erase every trace. The forensic team combed through the room, searching for any remnants that might have been overlooked. They found small traces of blood on the floorboards near the living room, blood that had seeped into the cracks during the struggle. It was barely visible, but under the right equipment, it was enough to suggest that something violent had happened in the house. Bishop watched Serena closely during the search, looking for any sign of nervousness or guilt. Serena remained calm, but Bishop could sense the tension beneath the surface. The detective knew that Serena was hiding something, but without concrete evidence, it was still too early to accuse her directly. As the team continued their search, they also began questioning Serena's movements in the days following Ronan's disappearance. Bishop had gathered information from several neighbors, including Althea Granger's statement about Kellen's truck being seen at the Valmont house. While it wasn't enough to prove anything yet, it raised questions that Serena would have a hard time answering. Serena's alibi was crumbling, and she knew it. She had managed to avoid direct suspicion for the first week, but the investigation was now reaching a critical point. Bishop's relentless pursuit of the truth had uncovered small but important details. Details that Serena had hoped would remain hidden. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that was troubling Serena. Kellen had become increasingly distant, and his phone call the previous night had confirmed her worst fears. He was losing his grip, and it was only a matter of time before he confessed everything. If that happened, Serena knew that there would be no escape. The police would connect the dots, and both she and Kellen would face the consequences of their actions. Bishop, for her part, was growing more confident in her theory. While she still lacked the smoking gun, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. The bloodstains, the missing car, the inconsistencies in Serena's story, and the sighting of Kellen's truck, all of it pointed to a cover-up. But she needed more, something that would definitively prove that Ronan hadn't simply disappeared, but had been murdered. As the search of the Valmont house continued, Bishop began to focus on the smaller, less obvious details. She knew from experience that killers often overlook the little things. Items moved, objects left out of place, traces of behavior that couldn't be scrubbed away. She instructed the team to take a closer look at the garage, hoping that they might find some clue as to what had happened to Ronan's car. What they found instead was a faint tire tread mark, partially hidden beneath boxes of household supplies. It wasn't much, but it was enough to suggest that a vehicle had been moved recently. Bishop made a note of it, yet another piece of the puzzle. The walls were closing in on Serena, and Bishop knew that it was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light. But while Bishop now had the evidence she needed, she also knew that Serena was smart, perhaps too smart for a simple arrest. The detective needed to make sure that when she brought Serena in, there would be no room for doubt, no chance for her to wriggle out of the consequences. Serena, of course, was unaware that Ronan's body had been found. She continued with her charade, thinking that she still had time to control the situation. But the discovery of the body changed everything. Bishop immediately began preparing for a confrontation. She had the evidence now, and all that was left was to corner Serena and force her hand. But it wouldn't be easy. Serena was clever, and she would fight to protect the life she had built, no matter the cost. Bishop knew she had to proceed carefully, or else Serena might find a way to slip through the cracks. The morning of the confrontation began like any other in Arlingstone, but for Serena Valmont, there was a growing sense of dread she couldn't shake. Over the past few days, Kellen had become increasingly difficult to reach, and the pressure of maintaining her facade was beginning to take its toll. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and every time she saw Detective Bishop's face, she felt the noose tightening around her neck. What Serena didn't know was that Bishop had already planned the next step. Armed with the evidence from the construction site, the detective knew that the time had come to confront Serena directly. There was no longer any doubt in her mind that Serena had orchestrated Ronan's murder and cover-up. The discovery of the body, combined with the mounting circumstantial evidence, gave Bishop everything she needed to bring Serena in for questioning. That morning, as Serena prepared to leave for the boutique, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Detective Bishop standing on the front porch, her expression calm but unyielding. "Serena," Bishop began, her voice steady, "I think it's time we had a conversation about your husband." Serena's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Of course, Detective. What is this about?" Bishop's gaze didn't waver. "We found Ronan." For a moment, Serena felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. She struggled to keep her expression neutral, but the shock was too much. She could feel her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. "I think it would be best if you came with me to the station," Bishop continued. "There are some things we need to discuss." Serena knew she didn't have a choice. If she refused, it would only make her look more guilty. She nodded slowly, trying to maintain her composure, but inside, she was in turmoil. They had found Ronan. That meant they had the body, the murder weapon, and everything else she had tried so desperately to hide. How had it all unraveled so quickly? At the station, the interrogation room was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the elegant life Serena had built for herself. She sat across from Bishop, her hands folded neatly in front of her, trying to project an air of confidence. But the truth was, she was terrified. Everything she had worked for was on the line, and she had no idea how to salvage the situation. Bishop, on the other hand, was calm and methodical. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, explaining how the body had been found, the details of the murder weapon, and the inconsistencies in Serena's story. As the detective spoke, Serena could feel her defenses crumbling. There was no way out of this. Bishop had been too thorough, too careful. But despite the overwhelming evidence, Serena wasn't ready to give up just yet. She had come too far to let everything fall apart now. She needed to think, to find a way to turn the situation in her favor. She was intelligent, resourceful. Surely there was still a way to outmaneuver Bishop. But Bishop wasn't giving her any room to maneuver. The detective knew that Serena was trying to find an opening, and she wasn't about to let that happen. With each question, with each piece of evidence, she closed the trap a little tighter, forcing Serena to confront the reality of the situation. The tension in the room was palpable, and for the first time, Serena realized that she might not be able to talk her way out of this. Bishop had her cornered, and the more she tried to resist, the more obvious her guilt became. Finally, after what felt like hours of questioning, Serena broke. She didn't confess outright, but the cracks in her story were too large to ignore. She stumbled over her explanations, contradicted herself, and eventually, it became clear that she was hiding the truth. Bishop had her. The weight of the investigation continued to press down on Serena Valmont. Her once meticulously controlled demeanor had begun to show signs of wear. Every step she took seemed heavier, every glance from Detective Bishop more scrutinizing. As each new piece of evidence surfaced, Serena felt her carefully constructed narrative unraveling. She had thought she could manipulate the situation, bend it to her will, but now it was clear that Bishop had outmaneuvered her at every turn. The discovery of Ronan's body had been the breaking point. For weeks, Serena had clung to the hope that the remote construction site would remain undisturbed, that no one would stumble upon the truth she had buried so carefully. But now, with the body found and the murder weapon identified, the clock was ticking. The evidence was overwhelming. The broken candlestick, the traces of blood in her house, and the growing suspicion surrounding Kellen. The case was coming together in a way she hadn't anticipated. As the pressure mounted, Serena tried to maintain her composure. Each day felt like a battle to suppress the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She moved through her routine at the boutique, forcing herself to smile at customers, pretending that nothing was wrong. But beneath the surface, her mind raced. She could sense that the police were closing in. Every question from Bishop, every visit from the neighbors, felt like another nail in her coffin. Kellen had been soon her greatest concern. His silence had been unnerving, and she feared that he might crack under the pressure. In her heart, she knew that if Kellen broke, there would be no saving either of them. He was the weak link, the one who had never fully understood the gravity of their actions. And now, with the police quietly closing in on him, Serena could feel the walls of her world starting to collapse. The investigation had reached a critical stage. Bishop had been gathering evidence piece by piece, constructing a timeline that painted a damning picture of the events leading up to Ronan's murder. The physical evidence was piling up, and even though Serena had tried to erase every trace, Bishop's forensic team had been thorough. The bloodstains in the house, the missing car, and the sighting of Kellen's truck had all added to the mounting case against her. Despite the overwhelming odds, Serena refused to admit defeat. She had always been a survivor, always able to navigate difficult situations with grace and intelligence. But now, with everything spiraling out of control, she began to realize just how fragile her position had become. The truth was closing in on her, and she could no longer control the narrative. While Serena struggled to maintain control, Detective Bishop moved forward with the next phase of the investigation. The discovery of Ronan's body had provided the physical evidence she needed, but Kellen's role in the crime remained a crucial piece of the puzzle. Bishop had known from the beginning that Kellen was involved, and now, with the evidence pointing directly to his participation, it was time to bring him in. Kellen's behavior in the days following the murder had been erratic. He had isolated himself, avoiding contact with anyone, and his parents had grown concerned. Bishop's team had been quietly monitoring his movements, waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came when they arrived at the Graves' home early one morning, prepared to bring Kellen in for questioning. As the police entered the house, Kellen's world came crashing down. He had known that this day would come, but he had been unable to prepare himself for the reality of it. The guilt that had been gnawing at him since the night of the murder had finally caught up with him. He had tried to push it aside, to pretend that he could move on, but now, faced with the police, he realized that there was no escape. At the station, Kellen sat alone in a sterile interrogation room, consumed by the weight of his actions. The truth that he had tried so hard to suppress could no longer be contained. The guilt, the fear, the shame, all of it rose to the surface. He had been drawn into something far beyond his control, and now, the consequences of his actions were about to come crashing down around him. The evidence against him was undeniable. The sighting of his truck, the discovery of Ronan's body, the bloodstains in the house, everything pointed to his involvement. And now, with the police closing in, Kellen knew that there was no way out. He had become trapped in a web of lies and deceit, and the truth was finally being laid bare. The trial of Serena Valmont and Kellen Graves quickly became the center of national attention. The quiet suburban streets of Arlington were now the focus of a media frenzy, with reporters and spectators alike eager to witness the downfall of two people who had once been the epitome of success. The once pristine image of the Valmonts was forever shattered, and the community struggled to reconcile the perfect family they had known with the gruesome crime that had been uncovered. The prosecution built a strong case, presenting the overwhelming physical evidence alongside Kellen's full confession. The bloodstains in the Valmont house, the broken candlestick, and the discovery of Ronan's body all painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. Kellen's detailed account of the affair, the murder, and the cover-up filled in the gaps, leaving little room for doubt in the minds of the jury. Serena's defense team attempted to paint her as a victim, claiming that she had been manipulated by Kellen into committing the crime. They argued that her role in the murder had been one of desperation, not malice, and that she had acted under duress. But the evidence told a different story. The carefully orchestrated cover-up, the lies she had told, and her attempts to control the narrative all pointed to her as the mastermind behind the murder. The trial lasted for weeks, with every detail of the case dissected in the courtroom. The jury was left to consider the depth of the betrayal and the cold calculation that had gone into covering up the crime. In the end, the verdict was clear. Serena was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Kellen, who had cooperated with the investigation, received a reduced sentence of 25 years. The fallout from the trial rippled through the community. The Valmont name, once associated with success and prestige, was now synonymous with scandal and betrayal. The house where Ronan had once lived, the home Serena had fought so hard to protect, now stood empty, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface of their perfect life. In the months following the trial, life in Arlington slowly began to return to its normal rhythm, but the memory of the Valmont case lingered like a shadow over the town. The story of Serena and Kellen, of their secret affair, and the brutal murder that followed, had left a lasting stain on the community. The once pristine reputation of the Valmonts had been forever tarnished, and the neighbors who had once admired Serena now spoke of her in hushed tones, as if mentioning her name too loudly might summon the darkness that had consumed her life. Serena's life in prison was a far cry from the luxury and comfort she had once known. Her attempts to manipulate the situation, to maintain control over her carefully crafted image, had ultimately failed. She had been exposed for what she truly was, a woman willing to do whatever it took to protect her secrets, even if it meant destroying the lives of those around her. Now, behind bars, she had nothing left but the memory of the life she had tried so desperately to protect. Kellen, too, faced the consequences of his actions. His reduced sentence offered him some hope of a future outside prison walls, but the weight of his guilt would never leave him. He had been young and impressionable, drawn into Serena's world without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. Now, as he sat in his cell, he had nothing but time to reflect on the choices that had led him here, the lies, the betrayal, and the murder that had torn apart his life. For Detective Bishop, the case was a bittersweet victory. She had solved one of the most complex and high-profile cases of her career, but the cost had been high. She had uncovered the truth, but the truth had destroyed lives. Ronan's, Serena's, Kellen's, and even the lives of those who had been indirectly touched by the crime. The perfect facade of Arlington had been shattered, and the cracks would remain for years to come. The Valmont house, once a symbol of success and prosperity, stood as a silent witness to the events that had unfolded within its walls. Its windows were dark, its rooms empty, and its gardens overgrown. It had become a monument to the fall of a family, a reminder that even in the most idyllic of places, darkness could lurk beneath the surface. In the end, the story of Serena Valmont and Kellen Graves was not just a tale of murder and betrayal. It was a story about the fragility of human relationships, the destructive power of secrets, and the lengths to which people would go to protect the lives they had built. For the people of Arlington, it was a reminder that even the most perfect facades could hide unimaginable horrors, and that sometimes the truth was far more terrifying than the lie. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.